The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as passengers shuffled into their seats, adjusting bags in overhead bins and fastening seatbelts with the usual impatience of travel. Among them was Maya Daniels, a young black mother with warm brown skin, tired yet determined eyes, and a swaddled baby in her arms. She had spent the last 2 days caring for her newborn without much sleep, trying to balance motherhood with the constant demands of her husband's world, a world she quietly supported but rarely flaunted. Her husband, David Daniels, was a powerful man, but Maya preferred anonymity. She dressed simply, wearing a soft cardigan and jeans, her hair tied back, and no flashy jewelry beyond her modest wedding band. To most people, she looked like any other exhausted new mom. As she settled into her assigned seat in business class, carefully securing the baby in her arms, she offered polite smiles to the flight attendants walking by. But one of them, a tall, blonde woman with sharp eyes and an air of arrogance, watched Maya with thinly veiled irritation. The attendant's name tag read Sandra, and from the way she moved, it was clear she believed herself the unspoken queen of the cabin. Sandra glanced at Maya's baby and immediately frowned. "You can't sit there with that infant," she snapped, her tone loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Maya blinked in surprise, explaining softly that she had purchased the seat had proper clearance and that her baby was less than 6 months old, well within airline policy for lap infants in business class. But Sandra wasn't interested in policies. She was interested in control. "People pay good money for peace and quiet up here," Sandra hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should have thought of that before dragging a screaming child onto a premium flight." Maya's cheeks flushed. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but the long days of exhaustion dulled her sharpness. Instead, she focused on calming her baby, rocking him gently against her chest. But Sandra wasn't finished. She leaned down closer and, in a burst of cruelty, slapped Maya's hand, the one cradling her child, hard enough to jolt her. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the baby let out a startled cry. The sound cut through Maya's chest like a blade, her protective instinct surging. But before she could react, Sandra straightened, eyes cold, and muttered, "Control your brat, or I'll have you moved." The entire business class section froze. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, while others whispered in shock. Maya's heart pounded in her ears. No one had ever disrespected her in such a demeaning, physical way, especially not in front of her child. Her hands trembled as she soothed the baby, but her gaze stayed fixed on Sandra, memorizing every detail of the woman's sneer. She wanted to scream, wanted to shout the truth, that her husband owned this airline, that Sandra's arrogance would cost her everything. But Maya bit her tongue. She had always chosen grace over rage. But as she sat there, humiliated and burning with silent fury, one thing crystallized in her heart. This moment would not be forgotten, and neither would Sandra. Little did the flight attendant know, her careless cruelty had just changed the trajectory of her entire career, and by extension, the fate of the very airline she served. The plane had barely begun boarding when tension started brewing. Naomi adjusted the blanket around her 6-month-old daughter, Amara, as she carefully made her way down the narrow aisle. Already exhausted from the stairs in the terminal, she had hoped that once on the plane, things would calm down. But the whispers started almost immediately. A couple seated nearby muttered under their breath, their tone dripping with disdain. Figures dragging a baby into first class. Naomi ignored them, though her chest tightened. She was used to subtle prejudice, the cold glances, the comments coded in fake politeness, but she wasn't prepared for what came next. When the baby fussed slightly, Naomi rocked her gently, whispering softly to soothe her back to sleep. That was when the flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read Cheryl, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked Naomi up and down, her gaze lingering on the infant. "Ma'am," Cheryl began curtly, "first class is meant to be quiet and relaxing. Maybe next time you should consider economy if you're traveling with a baby." Naomi felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice calm. "I paid for this seat, same as anyone else. My daughter is fine." Cheryl's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. A few passengers watched the exchange, some smirking, others pretending to scroll on their phones. Naomi thought it was over until Cheryl returned minutes later when Amara stirred again. Instead of offering assistance, Cheryl leaned in aggressively. You need to control her or I'll have you moved. Naomi held her ground. My child isn't disturbing anyone. Please respect us. The attendant's face flushed with anger, and then, in a shocking blur, she did something that silenced the cabin. With a sharp, deliberate motion, Cheryl's hand cracked across Naomi's cheek. The sound of the slap echoed through the plane, and Amara let out a startled cry. Gasps erupted from passengers all around. A man in business attire stood up shouting, "Did you just hit her?" Someone else fumbled with their phone, recording instantly. Naomi froze, one hand pressed against her stinging face, disbelief flooding her system. She had endured insults before, endured being treated as less than, but never had anyone physically struck her in public, and certainly not in front of her child. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Cheryl herself looked startled at her own action, but quickly masked it with defiance, crossing her arms as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. She was out of line, she muttered, disturbing first class with her noise. Naomi's heart pounded, but she refused to crumble. She drew in a steadying breath, lifted her chin, and met Cheryl's eyes with quiet fire. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, she said, her voice low but resonant, each word carrying a weight that made those listening shiver. Cheryl scoffed, rolling her eyes, clearly believing she still held the upper hand. But around them, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers began murmuring louder, some calling for the pilot, others demanding Cheryl be removed from service immediately. Naomi sat still, rocking Amara, her mind already racing ahead. Because what Cheryl didn't know, what none of them yet realized, was that Naomi's husband, calm, powerful, and impossibly protective, owned the airline they were sitting on. And Naomi was not going to stay silent. Not this time. The incident spread like wildfire through the cabin, whispers trailing behind the flight attendant's sharp slap like smoke from a fire. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some gasping aloud while others avoided looking at Naomi, afraid to get involved. The sting on her cheek burned, but what hurt more was the humiliation. The way the attendant, a woman named Claire, stood smugly with her arms crossed as if disciplining Naomi had been her right. Naomi clutched her crying baby close, whispering soothing words while fighting to keep her composure. She could have screamed, could have demanded an apology, but Naomi had learned long ago that dignity was her sharpest weapon. Still, she couldn't ignore the churning in her chest, the fury threatening to burst through. Claire, emboldened by Naomi's silence, turned to other passengers and muttered, "Some people just don't know how to behave in first class." The words weren't meant to be loud, but they carried enough for Naomi to hear, and for a few passengers to shift in discomfort at the obvious prejudice laced within them. One man, sitting across the aisle, cleared his throat and murmured, "That wasn't right," but he quickly ducked his head when Claire shot him a cold glare. Naomi's eyes welled with tears, not from weakness, but from restraint. Every instinct screamed to defend herself, yet she forced herself to breathe and think. She wasn't just a woman slapped in public. She was Naomi Carter, co-founder of Carter Airways, the very airline they were flying on, though no one here seemed to realize it. Her husband, James Carter, was the CEO, a man whose name commanded respect in aviation. Naomi had chosen to travel without the entourage and without drawing attention to her status, preferring privacy with her child. Now, that choice had left her exposed to Claire's unchecked arrogance. As the plane continued its flight, Claire moved about with a veneer of authority, offering wine to others while deliberately ignoring Naomi. Each slight was another slap, another reminder that prejudice lived even in the sky. Naomi pressed a kiss to her baby's head and silently vowed that this injustice would not be buried beneath polite smiles. By the time the wheels touched down, Claire's life and the airline's reputation would change forever. What Claire didn't know was that every action she had taken was being recorded by a teenager a few rows back who had captured the entire confrontation on his phone. Already, He was typing furiously, uploading it online, and within hours the world would see. Naomi, however, had no intention of waiting for the internet to fight her battle. She planned to call James the moment they landed, and when she did, the slap heard by a few in the cabin would echo through boardrooms and headlines worldwide. The slap still echoed in Maya's ears long after it happened, not because of the pain, but because of the humiliation that washed over her like a wave. She sat there frozen for a moment, her baby stirring uneasily in her arms, before she felt the heavy silence around her shift. Passengers in the rows nearby were no longer pretending to look away. They had seen everything, and their horrified expressions mirrored the injustice Maya herself felt. A young woman 2 rows ahead gasped aloud, her phone already in her hand, recording what had just taken place. An older man across the aisle muttered angrily, "That's assault," shaking his head in disbelief. For a moment, Maya wondered if anyone would step forward or if, like so many times before, people would shake their heads quietly and do nothing. But this time was different. The first to rise was a middle-aged woman in a neat business suit, her face flushed with outrage. "You cannot treat her that way," she snapped at the flight attendant, her voice trembling but firm. "She's holding a baby, for God's sake." Others chimed in, their voices layering into a chorus of protest. "We all saw what you did," one passenger shouted. "You're not going to get away with this." Another stood up and declared he would be filing a complaint immediately. Phones were raised all around Maya now, red recording lights flashing like beacons of accountability. The flight attendant, who only moments ago had worn the smug expression of someone confident in her authority, now looked cornered. Her eyes darted nervously between the growing crowd of angry passengers and the call button she had pressed for the head attendant. Maya sat still, stroking her baby's back as she listened to the rising voices around her. For the first time since the slap, a small spark of strength flickered in her chest. These strangers weren't turning away. They weren't allowing her humiliation to be brushed aside. Their outrage was real, and it was directed at the woman who thought she could treat her as less than human. The passengers' revolt grew louder when another crew member arrived, trying to calm things down. "Everyone, please take your seats," he began, but the crowd cut him off with a collective refusal. "No," one man barked, "not until you address what just happened." That woman struck a passenger. Maya's baby whimpered again, sensing the tension, and Maya softly rocked him, whispering comfort. A young couple leaned over from the row behind her, offering to hold her bags so she could keep her baby secure. "You don't have to go through this alone," the woman whispered gently. Maya's throat tightened, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming sense that for once people weren't ignoring her pain. They were standing with her. The flight attendant, cornered and trembling now, tried to defend herself. She was being aggressive," she stammered, her voice faltering under the barrage of passengers' angry rebuttals. "No, she wasn't," shouted the older man across the aisle. "We all saw what happened. You lost your temper." The passengers' revolt was no longer contained to the rows near Maya. Word had spread down the cabin, and murmurs of unacceptable and disgraceful echoed from every direction. A man near the back of the plane shouted that he worked in aviation law and would personally testify, if needed. As the confrontation escalated, the captain's voice finally came over the intercom, his calm but firm tone asking for order. But even he couldn't silence the rising tide of outrage. The flight attendant stood pale, cornered by her own actions, while Maya sat silently, her baby finally drifting back into sleep. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She didn't have to. The passengers had become her advocates, their voices carrying the truth she had been denied too many times before. What none of them knew, however, was that their outrage was about to reach someone with the power to turn this moment into something much bigger than a mid-air confrontation. For Maya's husband, the man who owned the airline itself, would soon be waiting at the gate. The cabin of the plane had fallen into a strange silence after the confrontation. Passengers whispered among themselves, some stealing glances toward Maya, while others avoided looking altogether, as if unsure of where to stand in a drama that had unfolded right before their eyes. The flight attendant who had slapped her, Denise, kept darting nervous looks over her shoulder, her earlier arrogance replaced with a quiet tremor of fear. Maya sat cradling her baby against her chest, rocking gently, her mind torn between outrage and heartbreak. She wasn't a woman who liked scenes, and she certainly didn't want her child's earliest memories to be wrapped in hostility. But what had happened wasn't just a moment of rudeness. It was humiliation, violence, and a stark reminder of how easily people like her were dismissed, disrespected, and targeted. Her baby's tiny hand brushed her cheek, and she closed her eyes, steadying her breath, vowing to protect not only him but the dignity that others tried to strip away. Across the aisle, a businessman finally spoke up. "That was out of line," he muttered, just loud enough for Denise to hear. Another passenger nodded, chiming in with "unacceptable." Slowly, voices of agreement rose, a ripple of solidarity spreading through the cabin. But Denise clung to her stubbornness, muttering something about passenger behavior and company policy. It was laughable, really, how far she was willing to twist the truth rather than own her mistake. Maya didn't bother engaging her. She had learned long ago that some battles were best fought strategically, not in heated exchanges with people who would never see past their prejudice. Instead, she pulled out her phone, opening the secure messaging app she shared with her husband. With one hand, she typed a calm but concise summary of the incident. "Attendant struck me. Baby was in my arms. Entire cabin saw. Will handle upon landing." She hit send, her thumb trembling not from fear, but from the rush of anticipation. She didn't need to threaten. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her truth, her dignity, and her position would be louder than any slap could ever be. She knew her husband well. David was protective of his family and fiercely intolerant of injustice, especially when it came to the empire he had built with a vision of equality and service. If this airline was his legacy, then this incident was an insult not only to Maya, but to everything he stood for. The murmurs among the passengers continued, some even offering Maya reassuring nods or soft words of comfort when they passed by for the restroom. Maya thanked them politely, though her smile never reached her eyes. She wasn't broken, but she wasn't untouched either. What Denise had done would echo beyond this plane, beyond the narrow aisles and sterile cabin lights. A line had been crossed, and Maya had no intention of letting it disappear into silence. As the plane began its descent, she pressed a soft kiss to her baby's forehead and whispered, "It's almost over. Mommy's got this." But deep down, she knew it was only just beginning. This was no longer about one woman's arrogance. It was about accountability, respect, and a reckoning that was about to shake the very airline itself. As the plane began its slow descent, the tension in the cabin was as thick as the clouds outside. Passengers had stopped pretending to be distracted, their eyes fixed nervously on the scene that had unfolded hours earlier. The flight attendant, Cynthia, sat stiffly at the back, her uniform pristine, but her face pale, drained of the arrogance she once carried like armor. Across the aisle, Amara held her baby close, the child finally asleep, her mother's arms a fortress of calm amid the turbulence of human behavior. Her husband, Darius, who had remained quiet for most of the flight, finally reached into his carry-on. With deliberate care, he retrieved a sleek black folder embossed with gold lettering, the official insignia of Skylux Airlines, the very company whose plane they were all flying on. Passengers leaned in slightly, curious and uneasy, as Darius placed the folder on his lap. Cynthia's eyes flickered nervously toward it, her throat tightening with dread. She had heard rumors before, whispers of airline executives traveling incognito to inspect service quality, but she had never believed them. The possibility that she had slapped the wife of someone connected to the airline hadn't just crossed her mind, it had barreled in now like a storm. Darius waited until the captain announced the landing preparations before standing, his towering presence commanding attention. He opened the folder, revealing credentials with his name, Darius Cole, Chief Executive Officer, Skylux Airlines. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers clasped their hands over their mouths, others exchanged wide-eyed glances, and one elderly man even whispered, "Good Lord!" Cynthia's face drained completely of color as her jaw fell slack. "Ladies and gentlemen," Darius said in a voice firm but controlled, "you've witnessed what my wife has endured on this flight. No passenger, no human being should ever be treated this way." His eyes cut briefly to Cynthia, whose body seemed to fold in on itself under the weight of his words. "Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of this airline, of my life's work, and of my family's values." Cynthia stammered, her hands trembling as she tried to speak. Sir, I didn't know But Darius raised a hand, silencing her with a calm authority more devastating than any outburst could have been. Amara's eyes welled with tears, not from pain or humiliation this time, but from the validation of her dignity, publicly defended in the very space where it had been assaulted. The passengers began to clap softly, not for the humiliation of the attendant, but for the courage of the moment, for the reminder that respect and humanity could still pierce through the coldness of cruelty. By the time the plane touched down, the truth was no longer a secret whispered between a few rows of seats. It was a revelation that would ripple beyond the cabin doors and into headlines across the world. Cynthia wasn't just facing a reprimand, she was about to face the full weight of justice from the very airline she thought she represented. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting streaks of crimson and violet across the clouds when Naomi and James stood side by side at the podium in the grand hall of the airline's headquarters. News of the incident had spread like wildfire across the world. Videos of the flight attendant striking a young black mother holding her infant had gone viral, sparking debates on racism, classism, and abuse of power in service industries. The global audience was watching, waiting for the airline's official statement. But tonight, it wasn't a corporate lawyer or a faceless executive delivering words. It was Naomi herself, the woman who had endured the humiliation, and James, the man whose name had long been synonymous with aviation power. Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward, and the room fell into an expectant hush. Naomi spoke first. Her voice was calm, but beneath it flowed the weight of every injustice she had carried and every woman who had been told to be silent. She described the incident in detail, how a mother's instinct to protect her child had been met not with compassion, but with cruelty, how the flight attendant had used her position to demean and assault rather than serve and support. She reminded everyone that customer service was not a privilege given at will, but a duty rooted in respect. James stood tall beside her, his arm protectively resting behind her back as he spoke next. His words were simple but sharp. "This airline bears my name, but today it will bear my promise. Disrespect will not be tolerated. Discrimination will not be tolerated. Abuse will not be tolerated. Not by staff, not by management, not by anyone." His announcement reverberated through the hall as he revealed sweeping reforms, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all employees, zero-tolerance policies for racial or gender-based misconduct, and most dramatically, a new leadership council to include underrepresented voices in decision-making roles. Gasps filled the room when James confirmed that Naomi herself would be appointed as the chair of that council, giving her the power to shape the airline's future. Reporters immediately began shouting questions, some about stockholder reactions, others about lawsuits, but Naomi silenced them with one firm line: "This was never about one slap. This was about dignity." Her words struck deeper than any press release ever could. In the weeks that followed, the airline's reputation transformed. Passengers praised the reforms, employees expressed pride, and Naomi's image became a symbol of resilience splashed across global media outlets. The flight attendant who had slapped her was no longer just a disgraced employee. She became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked arrogance. But for Naomi, the true victory wasn't her own vindication. It was walking into airports now and seeing mothers treated with gentleness, passengers treated with patience, and staff held to standards that valued humanity above hierarchy. That night, after the press conference ended and the cameras stopped rolling, Naomi and James returned home. Their Daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the storm her parents had weathered for her future. Naomi kissed her baby's forehead and whispered a quiet vow: "You'll grow up in a world that knows your worth." And for the first time since that terrible day on the plane, Naomi felt the sting of that slap fade into something else. Not pain, but power.